Iran, we knew the Persians. We had a lot. We loved Tehran back in the 30s, but things changed and became very fundamentalist. Well, that's Iran. Next on my list would be Lebanon. That's where the little flower shop guy came from that I was sitting next to on the Royal Jordanian flight. Uh, Civil war began in Lebanon in 1975, and it lasted for years and years. As a French mandate country, Lebanon, sitting on the sea, was such a beautiful country. In fact, Beirut was known as the Paris of the Middle East, a place of cafes, a lovely place. It's now, in many ways, a gutted place. Um, Lebanon became a place where Sunnis and Shias and Israelis and Christians and all this diverse mix of the Lebanese population fought it out and continue to still fight it out. I was in the northern part of Israel a couple of months ago and looked out over the Lebanese border. It looks so peaceful, but it's still not peaceful. And what happened in Lebanon was that Iran exported Hezbollah. We'll talk about Hezbollah. That's one of those names we hear and we know there must be something bad. It's some sort of terrorist group, but we don't really know about it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Hezbollah took parts of Lebanon. The Christians fought for parts of Lebanon. The Sunnis fought for parts of Lebanon. And guess what? The Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982. And one of the reasons they did that was because there had been raids by Hezbollah across the Israeli border. So Israel comes in and invades the southern part of Lebanon. At a certain point, we have bases in Lebanon. Hezbollah blows up one embassy. There were two or three. There was a French barracks blown up. The American embassy was blown. But the worst of all, our greatest loss of Marines since Iwo Jima was when Hezbollah bombed the Marine barracks in Lebanon. About 280 killed or so. We remember those sorts of things, but we don't know why they happened or who did them. We just know it's a mess in the Middle East. But Lebanon, at this date, is still a place of contention. It's not quite what it was, but Hezbollah still exists in Lebanon and still exports terrorism from Lebanon. Pakistan. You don't think of Pakistan. In fact, a lot of nations of Islam you don't think of because they are separated from the Middle East. Indonesia has maybe the greatest number of Islamic people in the world, way over in Southeast Asia. But Pakistan is part of the Indian subcontinent. And if you remember your history of that subcontinent, the British ruled India for a very long time, several hundred years. And in the 1900s, the King Edward VII was the Emperor of India. But things began unraveling. When we think of the Hindu groups in India, we think of Mahatma Gandhi. When we think of the Muslim groups in India, we think of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the father of modern Pakistan. What happened was basically the British allowed the Indian subcontinent to divide into Hindu and Muslim. It was a great division in which millions of people crossed in various directions to sort themselves out. And what ended up happening was India was a much more Hindu nation as a result of that. This is 1947. And as a result, Pakistan was the Muslim nation under Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, Pakistan had two parts to it, one on the east and one on the west. The eastern part became its own country later, Bangladesh, but the western part, with Karachi as part of it and Islamabad, is a Muslim nation. That's where you had people like Ali Bhutto. And Ali Bhutto was basically captured and executed as a result of a coup by the General Zia I mentioned before. And General Zia, in order to cement his relationships and his power, basically instituted, as I said, Sharia law in 1979. And Pakistan changed from a lot of secular and diverse understandings to a very basic Islamic fundamentalist understanding. Cynical because General Zia was no great Islamist, but that suited his purpose. He died later in a plane crash. You may remember Ali Bhutto's daughter, Benazir Bhutto, became prime minister, was murdered almost immediately. Nawaz Sharif became prime minister. And since then, we have been in uneasy relationship with Pakistan. Now, let's talk about Syria, part of the French Mandate. All we need to probably talk about with Syria, we know what a mess Syria is. We'll talk about that a little later. But what we really need to talk about is the Assad family. You may remember Hafiz Assad. His son is currently basically the dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. Syria is an ally, Shia ally of Iran. And we'll talk about the battle that's going to go on continues to go on in Syria. Again, it's the fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But that's Syria. Egypt has a very long history back to the pharaohs, but we'll just talk about British Mandate and following. The British had a presence in Egypt from the 19th century. British Mandate in Egypt, at one point, there's an Egyptian monarchy. You may remember, most of us remember King Farouk. King Farouk was the last of the Egyptian monarchy. He was overthrown by Gamal Abdel Nasser. You remember Nasser. Nasser brought a leftist free government that leaned toward the Soviet Union as an ally, and we never did like Nasser much, and as a result our relationships with Egypt were chilly. You may remember that Nasser led the Arabs in the initial attacks on the new Republic of Israel. So right now, in Egyptian history, after Nasser, maybe the most significant person to talk about is Anwar al-Sadat, who was president of Egypt, tried, as I said, in 1979, signed the peace treaty, inflamed fundamentalist Islam all through the Middle East. It was just 2 years later, I remember when it happened, when he was assassinated at a parade. And then Hosni Mubarak, his vice president, became president, ruled for decades, was replaced only in the recent 15 years or so by Mohammed Morsi, whose Muslim Brotherhood. It gets really confusing, doesn't it? Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim Brotherhood is fundamentalist also and has some roots with Shias, even though Egypt is primarily Sunni. Mohammed Morsi was overthrown, died just recently. They kept him in prison when he was overthrown, and Egypt has been ruled by generals ever since. Generals rule Egypt, generals rule Pakistan, both. Now, a bright spot for the United States in this is the country of Jordan. King Abdullah, Sharif Hussein's son, Faisal, became the first king of Iraq in the 20s. And next door, Jordan, King Abdullah, the other son of Sharif Hussein, was the king of Jordan. Abdullah was assassinated in 1952. I was on the spot where he was assassinated about 2 months ago on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, walking out of prayer in the Aqsa Mosque. His young son Hussein became the king of Jordan and remained the king of Jordan for many, many years until his death from cancer. And now his son Abdullah is the king of Jordan. But Jordan has always been an American ally, a country of about 10 million people or so. We keep air bases in the northern part of Jordan when we're supporting basically military operations in both Iraq and in Syria. One thing I didn't mention in my little airplane aisle meeting with with Najib Halabi is Najib's daughter Lisa, who went to Notre Dame. She was a cheerleader. She was the last wife of King Hussein of Jordan. She is the queen mother of Jordan, although she is not the mother of Abdullah. That was a previous wife. So we have great relationships with Jordan. In fact, King Abdullah went to high school in the United States. So we have great relationship with the Jordanians. Israel's a whole nother matter. Israel this week is a flashpoint. If you read your newspaper, you see that they were going to hold the trial of the Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he declared a COVID emergency and closed the courts, so they can't try him right now for any violations. Israel basically, after independence in 1948, with David Ben-Gurion as president, Israel was attacked by the Arab nations, won that battle, established their place in the Middle East, but they continue to be attacked. They've become a very secure nation now. In 1957, they did something very interesting that enrunded the United States, and that was they became a nuclear power. We kind of tried to regulate that, but they got all their nuclear information from the French, and they are a nuclear power in the Middle East, the only nuclear power. Iran aspires to that, is not yet there. But Israel basically is a state of again, of 10 million people, give or take. It's very small, but basically their industries, I found out a couple months ago, I was in a traffic jam in Tel Aviv. People think it's dangerous in Israel. I think the big danger is getting caught in a 6 o'clock traffic jam in Tel Aviv. But basically the Israelis have developed a nation that is technologically highly accomplished, that is highly secure in its defenses, leads the world in all kinds of ways of scientific ways. A lot of our techniques for irrigation have been and continue to be developed by the Israelis. And so it's a nation that's done very well, but it's a nation that has turned hard right. It's interesting that today's conflicts between American Jews, who generally are more on the left side of things, and the rightist Netanyahu government, it's interesting. 3 times they have tried to form a government, and Netanyahu has not been able to. Benny Gantz was recently asked to do that, but yesterday he was appointed, for whatever reasons, he was appointed the Speaker of the Knesset. And so who knows where this is all going, but Netanyahu will do everything to stay in power. But Netanyahu has also rallied around basically walking away from the two-state solution that was the basis of the Balfour Declaration, the basis of everything that happened in between. There were wars, 48 and 67 and 73, and but the long and short is, at the end, Israel has turned into a very conservative nation under Netanyahu, and the Palestinians may or may not ever have any state of their own. Iraq, after the overthrow of the monarchy, was for years in the hands of Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni. And basically, there are a lot of Sunnis and Shias in Iraq, but he attacked Iran. There was a 7-year war. He won. He was our ally. It was embarrassing for American politicians later, all those pictures shaking the hands of Saddam Hussein, because in the early 90s, when Saddam decided to invade Kuwait, we came to the aid, and that was initiated really to take over Kuwait, and we supported the defense of Kuwait. That's Desert Storm, if you remember Desert Storm. Desert Storm was a basically a I won't call it a draw because a million Iraqis were killed, and we did not go into Baghdad, but we basically stopped Saddam's incursion into Kuwait. Um, Afghanistan. Um, well, let's say one more thing about Iraq. You know the story. During the Bush administration, we invaded Iraq in 2003. We executed Saddam Hussein, and the result was that Iraq we tried to make it into a democracy. Recently, we made a drone strike on the Iranian General Soleimani on his way to the Baghdad airport. It did not result in war. We were afraid for a day or two. They attacked one of our barracks, didn't kill everybody. We declared the revenge over. But the bottom line is the Iraqis now ask for the United States to leave Iraq. Next door in Afghanistan, we have been embroiled just as the British were embroiled in the 19th century, just as the Russians were embroiled in the 70s. We have been embroiled in Afghanistan, and it begins to look like we will be leaving Afghanistan also. We'll see. Afghanistan has also asked us to leave. So a result of all the American issues since 2003 is that both Iraq and Afghanistan want us to leave. Now, Syria is in the midst of a civil war. Bashar al-Assad holds on to his power. He has inflicted incredible suffering on that country. Again, it's an Iranian, Saudi Arabian issue. The Russians have jumped in on one side. We jumped in on another. Recently, President Trump decided to withdraw our troops from a certain area and basically stop our support of the Kurds who were part of that fight. They immediately joined the Soviet group. And so there we are. Turkey was a secular state established in the 20s. The president now is a man named Erdogan. He has taken a hard Islamist political stance now to cement his power. Our relationship with him is rocky. And basically, Turkey, the Russians, ourselves until recently, the Kurds, the Iranians, and the Saudis were all involved in this brutal civil war that goes on in Syria. There are other Arab countries. I won't talk about the United Arab Emirates. She doesn't treat of them all that much, but you know, Bahrain and Dubai and Qatar and all those nations that are together, Emirates that have a lot of financial power. If you've ever been to Dubai, you know what a snazzy place that is. Maybe one of the worst human rights issues is going on right now, not only in Syria, but in Yemen. Yemen is a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. And millions have died, including from starvation. And that is an international scandal, but we've sort of stayed away from that. Now, having talked about these nations, let's talk about some names that surface in this book over and over again. Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, the PLO. We hear about them, but we basically know that there's something wrong, but we're not sure what it is. So let's at least sort out a little bit of that. The Hezbollah was an Iranian initiative. They still exist. It's Shia. It still exists in Lebanon. It does damage around the Middle East. And Al Qaeda has some names associated with it that you know very well. Rich Saudi boy named Osama bin Laden, and the plot that succeeded in toppling the Twin Towers in Washington was an Al Qaeda operation. The Taliban still rules part of Afghanistan. ISIS is Sunni, but it attracted enemies on both Sunni and Shia sides because ISIS is an attempt by some to establish a caliphate, actual land in the Middle East, that they'll have a caliph and they'll have the land. We have done everything to stop ISIS that we knew how to do. Recently, ISIS has lost most of its land, but ISIS has a way of forever popping up again. So we're not going to declare ISIS dead yet. But that's Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS. PLO is not quite that kind of organization. You remember the name Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat is dead now. Basically, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, fought for Palestinian rights and still does. Mahmoud Abbas is presently the head of the PLO. Fights for Palestinian rights in the Israel area. They have been notably unsuccessful. Today, a hotbed of PLO is an area called the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is basically one walled-off military. I can't even take tourists into the Gaza Strip anymore. It's basically, there's a wall around the Gaza Strip. That's the Palestinian. There's a couple million Palestinians that live in that area, but the PLO has done mischief in the eyes of Israel any number of times, and Israel is very opposed to the PLO, and the PLO pleads for a two-state solution, that there can still be a Palestinian state. And more it looks like, as long as Netanyahu is prime minister, there will not be a Palestinian state. And interestingly, the United States has basically sided with Mr. Netanyahu on that. So in some ways, the current administration has repudiated any two-state solution by supporting Netanyahu on those issues. Will there ever be a Palestinian state? Who knows? The most recent issues was the relocating of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that was a great insult to the Palestinian people. And frankly, Benjamin Netanyahu, people do not realize, but Benjamin Netanyahu was a dual citizen until he became prime minister, a citizen of the United States and of Israel. He basically gave up his U.S. citizenship when he became the head of Israel. But Netanyahu finds that a lot of his support comes from American evangelical Christians, which is really very interesting. There was a Pew Research paper recently that asked American Jews if they believe God basically set aside that land for the Jews. 2 out of 5 Jews said yes in that survey. 4 out of 5 American evangelical Christians said yes. So Netanyahu has found his new constituency in evangelical American Christians. And so, and he thinks he knows this pretty well. It wasn't all that long ago that the Democratic president did not give permission for him to come speak to Congress, and he went anyway because he got people in Congress to invite him. So he thinks he knows America pretty well. So I think that's all we need to say. It's a very confusing history, but we need to know our terms. We need to know our countries. And I'd say if you remember anything out of this, the thing to remember is Sunni and Shia, proxy wars between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They all go on. That's the basis of it. We have gotten ourselves embroiled in it. We have understood so little when we did. And it looks like we're probably exiting a lot of that right now. But that doesn't end it, because the question is, will there be a Palestinian state? What's going to happen to Yemen? Will the Syrian civil war ever be over? How does Iran come back from this fundamentalist clerical government that has put them under sanctions and in economic distress for so long? Who knows? But let's at least understand it, and hopefully understand it sometimes better than the American government seems to understand it sometimes. So I recommend Black Wave, because it's got some really interesting insights by Kim Ghattas, Black Wave. So I'll bring you another one, and one of these days we'll get to meet personally in the point. Hope that day comes pretty soon. Thank you.